I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Last Call for Tuesday the 7th of July. I'll be back with Heads Up Wednesday 10 a.m. In aviation news, Air New Zealand is the sole voice protesting against an application by Qantas Airways and American Airlines for a coordinated increase in flights on the Trans-Pacific route, planned for the start of the peak travel season in December. Qantas and American Airlines sought reauthorisation from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission last month for a 10-year expanded joint business agreement, or JBA, allowing them to coordinate operations on the Trans-Pacific route and boost capacity between Australia and the US by 9%. The Australian airline has upped their competitive ante on New Zealand's national carrier by forging a closer alliance with American Airlines, adding thousands of extra seats to its Trans-Tasman services in early spring, and plans to extend its budget offshoot Jetstar services in New Zealand to 4 regional destinations later this year. The ACCC previously authorised a similar 5-year arrangement between Qantas and American Airlines in September 2011. The interim authorisation for an extended JBA is being sought now because of American Airlines' plan to fly between Los Angeles and Sydney from December. That's the peak time for tourists on the Trans-Pacific route, and when the airline has relevant aircraft becoming available, it doesn't want to sit idle. An extended alliance would let Qantas resume services on the Sydney-San Francisco route, and the partners have also indicated they want to break Air New Zealand's lucrative monopoly on flights between Auckland and the mainland US by flying Auckland to Los Angeles as early as next year. Air New Zealand currently attracts Australian passengers onto its Trans-Pacific flights via a stop in Auckland. In a submission to the competition regulator, Air New Zealand said it was inappropriate to grant interim authorisation without a full and considered analysis by the ACCC. Qantas and American Airlines already had authorisation to coordinate on designated routes under the original JBA, which is valid to June 2016, it said. Air New Zealand said if either party wants to start a Sydney-San Francisco service, they can do so alone or with the support of the other through code share, block space, wet lease or other arrangements. Air New Zealand submitted while any delay to full cooperation between the parties could result in a less than optimal launch of these services from the parties' perspective. This delay, it says, has only been caused by the parties themselves not allowing sufficient time for the authorisation process. In response to third-party submissions, Qantas and American Airlines said the interim authorisation would allow them to operate under the existing JBA with the new Trans-Pacific routes added in until final antitrust immunity is received. Comments on the proposed additional capacity have been overwhelmingly positive, it said, with only Air New Zealand raising an objection. They said Air New Zealand's stated concerns must be viewed in the context of the strategic advantage it would enjoy from delaying or diluting the success of the introduction of the applicant's new joint services. Qantas and American Airlines said it wouldn't be commercially feasible to launch the new services separately from the existing coordination, as Air New Zealand suggested, given they manage Trans-Pacific routes as a whole rather than on a route-by-route basis. The ACCC is due to make a draft determination next month and a final one in October-November. To the Hong Kong market, stocks in Hong Kong tumbled the most in 3 years as the financial shakeout on the mainland spreads to those foreign investors can buy. The Hang Seng Index shed 3.2% and is now down 11.3% since its April high. Hong Kong-listed Chinese companies known as H-shares are down 3%. Until now, Hong Kong has largely avoided the contagion effect of the rollercoaster trading that has wiped out about $2.4 trillion US in value from the Chinese shares during a 3-week decline. The Shanghai Composite ended up 2.4% compared with earlier gains of as much as 7.8%. The smaller Shenzhen market is down 2.7%, and the China Next Board, composed of small-cap stocks, is down 4.3%. All indexes still are off more than 25% from highs reached in June. Over the weekend, Chinese authorities halted all new IPOs, and the central bank is helping investors to buy equities in a bid to prevent a meltdown. But capital flight is still evident as Stock Connect, the trading link between Hong Kong and Shanghai, had its busiest day since launching last November. A total of $2.16 billion US was withdrawn over the course of the trading day. Chinese investors also withdrew a net 1.45 billion yuan from Hong Kong-listed stocks. Li Mao, an assistant professor of finance at Warwick Business School, says the Chinese government is still finding it difficult to accept the fact that financial markets cannot be driven by policies and stock returns cannot be dictated by an authority. He says, I'm surprised at the actions of the government. These actions are like casting political pressures to modify the trading behaviour of investors or to blatantly dictate how investors should trade just to meet the political goals the government wants to achieve from the stock market. But in the long run, he says, these actions are not sustainable. To form a sovereign fund to mitigate the non-fundamental shocks is generally a good idea for emerging markets. However, to assign a political task to these funds that they need to support the market index to a certain level is absurd. What has happened in the Chinese markets is a good example of what happens.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 7th. I'm John Stewart. Those crazy crowdsourced designs are all that's on the table for the $28 million flag consideration project. That's according to our reporter Chris Keel, who joins me now. Chris, you talk about crazy crowdsourced designs. What are some of them looking like?
Well, there's been the Kiwi farting rainbows. There's been a few that look like the designer is colourblind or on LSD or otherwise not a professional designer.
Right, not very promising.
Well, there's been 5,200 designs uploaded, so they sort of defy anything but statistical analysis. Yeah, but there's been some pretty marginal ones. There's been a couple of promising ones like Dick Frizzell and his son Otis Frizzell have uploaded quite sort of promising ones, but I was just wondering whether the flag consideration panel would also seek some designs from professional designers or otherwise step outside this crowdsourced process, but so far they haven't.
Mm. Well, apparently Gareth Morgan has come up with $20,000 for a flag design.
He has. The flag consideration panel seems to be just offering honour and glory for coming up with a new flag if we do change. But Gareth has stepped into the breach, or lurched into the breach, as he so often does, and he's put up $20,000, and for that you get the privilege of designing his entry, which he'll then submit himself. And the deadline's coming up quite fast, July 16.
So he gets the honour and glory.
It could be. It could be the next New Zealand flag designed by Gareth Morgan, especially as he's the only one offering a bounty that might see some professional designers put some time into it.
So all fairly silly, for want of a better word, at this stage, is it, Chris?
So far we've had the website where you can upload your feelings about the flag, and people said they want it to represent the future and the past and various contradictory things. And we've had this upload page which has sort of been mocked around the world on BuzzFeed and Mashable, and we've had these meetings with a handful of people attending. So far, it seems like someone's almost trying to sabotage the process. But personally, I think Canada did really well changing its flag, and it's a bit silly having a flag that's the same as New Zealand. So I hope once this crowdsourced phase is over, we'll get into something more serious.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks very much, and we'll leave it there. Thanks, Chris.
NBR Radio with Bailey's, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 7th. I'm John Stewart. And I'm joined by Sally Lindsay in Auckland and Chris Hutching in Christchurch for our weekly property talk. Now, Sally, you've got some news for us about a downtown site which is planned for Auckland's tallest building. Where is that?
Right where we're sitting, actually.
Right where we're sitting.
Yes, right next door. 2 sites next door and one on Gore Street. And they've used the air rights over this building to get a 170-metre tall building resource consent. The owners of the property have decided not to go ahead with the development themselves, so they've put the properties on the market with the resource consent and plans for the huge 170-metre, 48-storey apartment tower. So it'll be the city's biggest building if it ever gets out of the ground. But as we've noticed in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk in Auckland about great big huge property apartment developments, and none of them have actually appeared.
And they don't seem to materialise, yeah.
No, and a lot of them are owned by overseas investors. And so whether this goes ahead, who knows? But if it did, it would be much bigger than the Vero Centre, which is the city's tallest building at the moment, or occupied building at the moment, and it would have commercial retail on the ground floor along Commerce Street, where there already is retail, but all those people in those shops are sitting on demolition clauses in their leases so that they can tear them all down and start again. And the building we're in, Achilles House, which is actually an historic building, it's got building covenants over it,
Right.
so they can't disturb the look and the facade of this building. So it will be interesting. There's a consortium of people own these sites, one of whom is Andrew Crookseena's wife, well-known Auckland developer. And then on another site there's a variety of people on the title. So
All local investors, though?
Most of them, and I assume they've just all got together and they've formed a joint venture and decided to sell on the property.
Talking about these areas of land in the CBD in Auckland from which buildings never seem to appear, what's happening with the car park area in Victoria Street on the corner of Elliott Street there? Our tallest building was supposed to go in there, wasn't it? But it hasn't. Doesn't seem to have happened.
And the tallest building was supposed to go on Elliott Street as well, in that empty site there. But they seem to get these owners and they get plans. I don't know how many of them actually get resource consents, and then it all comes to a grinding halt.
Yeah.
Perhaps the land costs too much and the building costs are too much, but they just never seem to get off the ground, although everyone is convinced that people do want to live in the city and that there is a big demand for apartments. So why they don't go ahead, who knows? But a lot of it's probably just land banking. They buy the land and then sell it on.
Sit on it
and not do anything. But these people with this building, at least they've got a resource consent and plans for the site. So whoever buys it can actually go ahead with some sort of development fairly quickly.
Yeah. Now, Chris, Fletcher Building have picked up a Central Christchurch contract. Quite a good one?
Well, it's a big one. It's probably one of those things that will go on for a number of years. They do have a lot of challenges because the area that they're talking about is a place called Latimer Square, which is on the east. It's now called by the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority is called the East Frame. And they don't like that name too much because the East got battered a lot in the earthquakes, so I've set up a three-man panel to change the name of that from the East Frame to something else. But meanwhile, Fletcher Challenge apparently is the preferred developer. Now, when you look at this deal, it hasn't really been consummated yet. It will be signed possibly later this year. So there's a lot of ifs, buts and maybes about it. But it provided a fair amount of hoopla here when the PM and co were on their usual wing-ins for photo opportunities, and they brought this up. And Fletcher's is talking about a number of apartment buildings down this area. The history of Christchurch is such that apartment buildings tend to go okay around the Hagley area, Hagley Park we're talking about, where there are views over the Avon River, and there are amenities. You can go for a jog or run or bike ride or do things like that. The area that they're talking about is an area that's basically been demolished. It's a huge swathe of green empty space at the moment. So trying to encourage people to come in there, especially the first entrance, while there'll be a lot of construction going on and few amenities, I think is going to be a real challenge. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's going to happen yet.
And you were going to talk about the Eden site too.
Yes, well, in the same week that we had this rather optimistic deal for Fletcher's, we had a chap called Tim Smith, S-M-I-T. He's a UK guy. I think he got knighted for his services to tourism. And he turned up in town with the help of a number of people and a PR agency to talk about a thing called the Eden Project, which is based in Cornwall, I think, in south of England. And from what I can tell, it sort of seems to be a bunch of glass houses and a sort of a tourism family visitation place
Yeah, there was quite a bit about it on the TV news the other night, I noticed. He's out here at the moment, isn't he, the guy?
He's out here at the moment, and he's had a really good trot in the local newspaper. But I felt that, I didn't get to see him myself, but I felt that one of the most instructive articles was in the weekend paper on Saturday, where he was interviewed at length, and finally the reporter brought up the question of the funding of $100 million and where this is going to come from. And in the manner of all good entrepreneurs, he said, well, that's just the last detail that we have to look at. And in the meantime, it's important that we accept the concept and celebrate it and start thinking ahead, and then we'll look at the feasibility and possibly money. Well, look, I'm sorry, but this is just pie-in-the-sky fantasy stuff. In a city where we're struggling to get investment, to get basic, things rebuilt, civic amenities and whatnot, it sounds okay, but really, when you look deeply into it, to get to, for example, the entrance... the charge to get in the UK is about £25, which if you're going to use that, 3 times that, you're looking at $75, maybe $100 or something for people in Christchurch to come to that. You're looking at a population of 4 million. England's got, 60, 70.
Yeah.
Same in France and Spain, Germany.
But also, Chris, you've got to remember that when it comes to financing, that they can get very handsome EU subsidies. In fact, I've just been over in the UK, and I was surprised to see that blue ring of yellow stars beside so many different buildings, proudly announcing that they'd been subsidised by the EU. We don't have that access, of course.
No, unfortunately, we don't. So, I think this is a bit of a splash for Sir Tim Smith, but in any case, we do have some of these sorts of plans for exhibition-type things underway, supposedly as part of our blueprint rebuild already. So, frankly, I can't quite see the point in the Eden project for a start, and certainly franchising it out here in order to help support the original one, which has been struggling a bit, although Sir Tim assures us it's back now in profitability, strikes me as a bit bizarre. I think it'd be better off to start in California.
Yeah. Now, Sally, Auckland is poised to become the next emerging tech city with the potential to lead the Asia-Pacific area. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I don't think that's pie in the sky. It actually is already happening. The council's already opened up one building. They refurbished the historic Lysart building, and they've opened that up to tech and entrepreneurs. And their own council-controlled organisation, ATED, is running that and running the Grid Auckland, which is the tech centre down at Wynyard Quarter. So some of the big players in the property business are also going to put buildings down there that are going to be available for tech incubators and startups. And so it's all sort of going ahead. So Jones Lang LaSalle brought out an expert on tech cities, and he says that Auckland is right on the verge of becoming a leader in this field, and that we've got the buildings, we've got the infrastructure, and the city could actually become a major player in this area. But, I mean, a lot of the older buildings that are sort of the brutalist architecture type will need refurbishing, and all the new buildings will need all the latest IT and all that. But it's quite on the cards that down in this area of Auckland it will become a leading tech area for companies who can export out to the rest of the world.
Right. Okay, we'd better wrap it up there for this week's Property Talk. Thanks very much, Sally and Chris.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.
To the courts, CPA Australia hasn't suffered a loss of members over the last few years, and it had the opportunity to rebut claims at a Wellington conference made by its rival but declined to do so. That's what the defence team for the former New Zealand Institute of Chartered Accountants is arguing in the High Court in Wellington. CPA is suing the institute, which has since merged with the Institute of Accountants in Australia, for defamation and for breaches of the Fair Trading Act. CPA says the institute made false and defamatory statements at 2 conferences of accountants, in a flyer for students at Massey University's Albany campus, in advertisements published in the New Zealand Herald and the National Business Review, and in a story published in NBR. These statements alleged CPA had inferior education standards and misused membership fees, and claimed that chartered accountants, those with the Institute's qualification, earned more than those with the CPA's qualification. CPA also says the Institute's Chief Operating Officer, Kirsten Patterson, told 2 conferences that CPA wasn't a member of the Global Accounting Alliance because its education standards weren't good enough. Until 2012, the Institute had a monopoly over certain types of accounting work, including audits. The CPA is alleging it suffered because fewer accountants joined it as a result of these statements than would have otherwise, and is claiming $50,000 in damages plus costs and other relief at the court's discretion. During the opening day of the 7-day trial, Bruce Gray, QC, on behalf of the Institute, cross-examined CPA's country manager for New Zealand, David Jenkins, on what happened to CPA's membership numbers during the period of the alleged offences, said to be between 2011 and 13. Mr Gray said to Mr Jenkins, data from the CPA's annual report for the 6 years between 2009 and 14 suggests that your business overall has grown at a broadly consistent rate and has been unaffected by what's been said. Mr Jenkins said, I would agree it's grown, but I would disagree it's been unaffected. Earlier, Mr Jenkins said of the about 100 people who attended the Wellington conference in 2013, which he addressed, between 5 and 10 were CPA members. He agreed a recording played in court of Ms Patterson's speech at the earlier Christchurch conference, which he didn't attend but which he was told about, was broadly the same as the one she delivered at the Wellington conference. Mr Gray said, by the time you spoke at the Wellington conference, you knew what Ms Patterson had said in Christchurch, so you were warned in advance. He said in Wellington you spoke after her, so you had the opportunity to respond to anything she may have said. Mr Jenkins said while he did have the opportunity, he chose not to because I deemed that to be unprofessional. Earlier, Mr Jenkins told the court he hadn't wanted to engage in a public argument between the 2 organisations at a conference of members of the profession. In the recording played in court, Ms Patterson told the Christchurch conference the CPA isn't a member of the GAA because their education standards aren't recognised as being the same as the one you've worked so hard to achieve. Ms Patterson said the Institute was already seeing the impact of competition from CPA, with fewer graduates choosing to enrol in its education program and an increasing percentage of companies saying they don't care whether the accountants they employ have CPA qualifications or are chartered accountants. Talking about CPA's marketing, Ms Patterson said, I don't think that's the best use of members' fees. The court case is continuing. To SME funding. A newly established private equity fund is teaming up with banks to provide growth capital for established small and medium-sized businesses. New Ground Capital, which is developing a range of investment products spanning private equity, unlisted property and social enterprise, has recently set up the SME Partnerships Fund. Its information memorandum was launched on the market last week, and a capital raising through wholesale investors is underway, with the goal to reach 30 to 40 million, which will be lent to SMEs. Investors have been asked to invest $1 to $3 million for a 20 to 40% stake in profitable SMEs. New Ground co-founder and managing director Roy Thompson, who was formerly Westpac's head of private wealth management, says SMEs with equity valuations between 5 to 50 million struggle to find equity to grow. According to Stats New Zealand, there are more than 16,000 businesses with valuations of this size, and 28% of New Zealand's GDP is generated from businesses with fewer than 21 employees. Mr Thompson says the fund aims to fill the void between start-up-focused equity crowdfunding with its $2 million maximum, tech-focused venture capital, and traditional private equity appetite for investments over $10 million. He says SMEs are in the middle, perhaps looking for $1 to $3 million, but to help secure cash flow lending from their bank to grow, the market's very informal and based around friends and family. A lot of small business people are not necessarily willing or able to tap friends or family for obvious reasons. He said there's a lot of business lending hidden in mortgage figures, so many SMEs are financed against property, but it can have the effect of holding businesses back because business people are less willing to take risk when the family home is on the line. New Ground has partnered with commercial banks and a couple of large accounting firms which will source business and carry out initial due diligence checks. Although there are challenges to profitable investment in the SME sector, Mr Thompson believes this bank and accounting firm partnership will lower Newground's management costs and help entice wholesale investors. Initially, the fund will cover 15 business loans, with Newground only investing if the bank is on board too.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 7th. I'm John Stewart. The Prime Minister and Minister of Finance have both said China's economy is a bigger threat to New Zealand than the Greek debt crisis. I'm joined by Neville Gibson on this story. Neville, do you agree with that?
They're certainly right. I think what we're seeing in China is not just a slowdown in the economy, but the biggest share market rout that there has ever been in history. Fortunately, that is confined pretty much to Chinese share markets and Chinese investors, and depending on where you get your figures, the losses so far, and this has all happened since the middle of June, could be between 2.4 trillion US dollars, and Bloomberg have just reported the losses could be as much as 3.2 trillion. Now, you've got several share markets going here. You've got in China, you've got the Shanghai and Shenzhen and some allied share markets there. They yesterday had a bit of a bounce back, mainly because over the weekend the Chinese authorities moved in and pumped a whole lot of money in as they could to the local market. But linked to this are a lot of what they call dual-listed H shares, which are Hong Kong-listed shares of Chinese companies. And it was Hong Kong that saw the meltdown. Its main index, the Hang Seng, fell 3.2, down 11.3% since its April high. And so we're seeing what you might call a contagion spreading from China to Hong Kong in these listed shares.
So what are the latest developments in China itself?
Well, the main development over the weekend was an effort by the Chinese authorities to prevent the share slide, and they certainly have succeeded for doing it, at least temporarily. They've halted all new IPOs or initial public offerings. The central bank and the funding agencies have set up almost a sovereign fund to go and buy shares. They also are backing individual investors and funds to buy shares. So that's what they're doing in China. Of course, Hong Kong does not act like that. There, the foreign investors are pulling out their money as fast as possible. There's a thing called Hong Kong Connect, which directly was set up last November between Hong Kong and Shanghai, and this enables approved investors in both markets to trade with each other. And yesterday saw the busiest day they've ever had, and essentially you could read that as capital flight. And according to the figures that have come out, some 2.2 billion US dollars was withdrawn over the trading day yesterday. The market's yet to open, or it's about to, so we don't know what is going to be happening there today.
So how successful will the Chinese be in trying to stem further falls?
Well, there I've got to pass over to the experts. One of them, Professor of Finance at Warwick Business School, Professor Lei Mao, he's put out quite a few comments, and he's saying that the Chinese government is still finding it difficult to accept that financial markets can't be controlled by policies and stock returns can't be guaranteed by authorities. In other words, he's warning anyone who wants to play in this market that this is very strange behaviour by a government. It shows that the Chinese authorities are a little bit, well, we might say naive. I'm putting words in his mouth, but he's saying that these long run, these actions are not sustainable. He says, while setting up a sovereign fund's a good idea in some areas, that to give it a political risk and a political purpose is quite ridiculous. And he says that there's a danger to world markets if the Chinese persist in trying to turn back the tide, as it were.
Does the share market crash have an impact on New Zealand investors?
Well, not directly, because we can't invest other than the Hong Kong stocks, and no doubt there'll be some funds that have invested there. But the worry is that this is linked to a downturn in the Chinese market, and obviously although the Chinese market is obviously and economy is quite different from others, but any fallout like this where trillions of dollars are being lost must have a flow-on effect if those losses are mainly investors in China or affects their economy in any way.
Now, on the good news side of the ledger, the price of oil has also taken a hit. What does this have to do with China?
Yeah, well, this was a surprising development. Almost overnight, oil prices started to slide in the US on Friday. But yesterday they took their biggest one-day drop since April when they started falling. That's a 3-month low. Mainly it's China's appetite for oil, and it's been keeping the prices up. In fact, China, according to the International Energy Agency, accounts for about 30% of global demand, and any hit on that demand in a market that's already quite glutted, and investors in oil and traders in oil, they are looking both at the volatility around Greece with the rise in the US dollar as a kind of safe haven. That always has a depressing effect on oil prices. But the other one are the talks going on over nuclear arms and Iran in Vienna. And the Iranians say as soon as those sanctions come off, boy, have we got a lot of oil to sell. So you've got two things going on there on the world scene that will further increase the supply of oil, while the Chinese demand looks set to be dropping in the near future.
Neville, thanks for that.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett. Open for breakfast, lunch and dinner and everything in between. NBR Radio.
To the Auckland Council, a line-by-line review of Auckland Council's $3.5 billion a year operational spending is being demanded by Councillor Christine Fletcher. The former mayor will put an amendment to the long-term plan before the council, calling for an in-depth review of all council expenditure. Ms Fletcher, who's tried a couple of times to promote alternative budgets but been knocked back, says a probe into the council's expenditure is well overdue. She says we do not have a mandate to keep on spending when the long-term plan containing the budget passed by only one vote 10 days ago. She says we're at crisis point. Ratepayers have clearly said they won't go on paying for ever-increasing rates. The council has never done a stock take, and we need to have all activities identified, scoped, and a consultation plan put before the public on spending options before we go any further. She says if the council is going to prioritise transport as Aucklanders want, then other activities have to be cut back or pared back. She said we need good contestable advice that we haven't had. She's backed in her quest for a spending review by Councillor Cameron Brewer, who says it's well overdue. He says operational spending continues to climb when amalgamation was about better managing expenditure. He says, unfortunately, in local government, there is now a tendency for elected representatives to take less interest in line-by-line operational expenditure, but to instead focus on capital projects. Mr Brewer says every councillor can probably give the costs down to the last cent on the City Rail link, but few could give any data about the council's huge operational expenditure. He says the council also needs a better view of council-controlled organisation spending. He said, I haven't been able to ascertain a TEED's costs, how much it spends separately on tourism, events and economic measures. We can't even get a breakdown on our TEED's activities to that level. Mr Brewer says he'll strongly be supporting Ms Fletcher's amendment. He said instead of helping with a review, all council management say is give us a fiscal envelope and we'll do the rest. This has not worked, and if we don't exercise better management and oversight, the next council will. Council Chief Executive Stephen Town says there's nothing to stop amendments to the long-term plan being put before the council, but he's asked councillors to think long and hard about them as they are time-consuming and expensive. He says it's taken us 18 months to produce the long-term plan, and many millions of dollars go into producing the material needed for a plan. He says the council didn't agree to an across-the-board efficiency review of the entire council operation during debate on the long-term plan, mainly because it's not a practical way to attack the problem. He says a line-by-line review of expenditure would cost a fortune and potentially bring council operations to a standstill. Nobody would thank us for that, as there are millions of lines of expenditure. In the budget decisions, council management took on a savings target across 10 years of $2.6 billion. The savings target for this financial year is more than $200 million. It's equivalent to another 12 to 13% rates increases if we don't do it, Mr Town says. It gives an idea of the size of the challenge. Inside that target, he says, there are a range of reviews we will be undertaking over the course of the next year aimed at doing more for less and being more effective at what we do. He says changes 3 years ago to the Local Government Act mean the council can take a deep dive into all its activities and services areas once every 6 years. Mr Town says the sort of job Ms Fletcher is outlining is something that is much more practical to do in our series of reviews over a 2 to 3 year period, and by the time we get to the end we will pretty much be starting on round 2. It becomes a continuous improvement activity rather than a let's review everything all at once. In media news, the New Zealand Herald has announced that Pebbles Hooper has resigned from her role as co-editor of the Herald on Sunday's spy gossip pages following a backlash about one of her tweets. New Zealand Herald weekend editor Mariana Alexander said in a statement, "Today I accepted the resignation of Pebbles Hooper effective immediately." Ms Hooper will also no longer appear in the Weekend Herald's Canvas magazine, in which she has had a long-running advice column with her mother, fashion designer Denise Lestrange-Corbet. Ms Alexander's statement says, "As I said on Sunday, the views she expressed in her tweet were distressing and are obviously not shared by me or the Herald on Sunday. I have also apologised to a family spokesman for the contents of the tweet and the distress it caused them." Ms Alexander had been quick to front-foot the controversy caused by a tweet by Ms Hooper on Saturday, telling media that we are treating it extremely seriously and will be taking this matter up with her this week. Ms Hooper's tweet said, "I'll get major slack for this, but leaving a car running inside a closed garage while your kids are in the house is natural selection." It was a reference to the deaths of Ashburton mother Cindy George and her children after they were overcome by exhaust fumes. A car had been left running to prevent its battery from going flat in the garage of the house they were staying at. After copping criticism for her comment, Ms Hooper tweeted the following statement on Saturday. "I deeply regret any distress caused to the family. I apologise for my wording and take responsibility for upsetting those involved, and I was careless in my actions," she wrote. "The issue I regrettably tried to raise was about parental negligence and the precautions needed to ensure the safety of those who are unable to care for themselves. I never aimed to target or isolate the issue to one family. Again, I apologise for my actions and have the family in my thoughts." However, the explanation attracted almost as much criticism as the original tweet. Ms Hooper's Twitter account has since been closed. After her resignation from her New Zealand Herald roles was announced, NBR approached MediaWorks to ask whether, in light of the controversy, Ms Hooper would continue to appear as a regular panellist on The Paul Henry Show. A spokeswoman for the company said she was unable to provide an answer as the team that makes the program had left for the day, and that a response would be provided tomorrow.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 7th. I'm John Stewart. Business confidence has fallen to the lowest level in 3 years, but it's still relatively high. I'm joined by our political and economics editor in Wellington, Rob Hosking. Rob, just how are these figures looking if you go beneath them, let's say?
Yeah, this is an important survey. This is the quarterly survey, the NZIR survey. They've been running it since 1970. They survey roughly 2,000 businesses.
No farmers, though, are there?
No farmers. It's one of the most important leading indicators. It's and as far as that farm picture goes, and you can see that in some of these figures this morning, it does, of course, survey businesses who supply the farming sector, and the biggest drop really was in the retail sector, and it was very noticeable that when you looked at the regional breakdown of that, the areas where that was falling is in the areas which are high dairy supply areas, so Waikato, Taranaki, Southland, etc. So this is, so the dairy slowdown is showing in that area.
Yeah, it's certainly feeding through, isn't it?
It certainly is, and the question really, and this is the biggest question overriding the entire economy at the moment, is how long it's going to feed through, because 6 weeks or less than 6 weeks ago, a month ago, the assumption was that certainly the Reserve Bank was still making the assumption that the dairy slowdown would be picking up again. The dairy price would be picking up again, and going back a month before that, or 3 weeks before that, the Treasury forecast and the budget, and they were talking about GDP growth of around 3% for each of the next 3 years. Today's survey suggests otherwise. We're still looking at growth. We're certainly not looking at a recession. But today's figures suggest, I asked Christina Ling, who's the senior economist there, and she said, look, around 2.6% GDP. There's the other thing is, and I'd add a caveat to that, because I think even that might turn out to be slightly on the high side. This survey was done earlier in June, and it covered, most of the responses came in before the Reserve Bank's last monetary policy statement. That's when they announced they cut the official cash rate 0.25% and signalled there'd be at least one more rate cut.
Yeah, well, I mean, what is Christina Leung forecasting about the OCR as a result of these figures?
Well, they've firmed up their expectations of another cut at the end of the month rather than in September. The Reserve Bank next reviews the OCR on the 23rd of July. And look, the NZIO is not the only bunch of economists who are saying that. It's increasingly looking likely that Governor Graham Wheeler will do another 0.25% cut on the 23rd of July. The question is, what happens after that, whether there's one more, whether there's two more, and the timing of that. And the next cut timing after that is September. The NZIO this morning said, look, they see that as a line call. I'm starting to wonder if it is going to be such a line call, and even that suggested there could even be a fourth one in October or early December.
Indeed. Okay, thanks very much for your insights there, Rob.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform, www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
In market news, Rangatira Investments, the Wellington-based investment firm, bought 70% of lab equipment firm BioStrategy for an undisclosed sum to help the firm expand into new markets and broaden its offering. Rangatira said in a statement it bought the stake from BioStrategy directors Graham Thompson and Robert Lyon, who will keep 30% of the firm and remain executive directors of the company. BioStrategy sources products from high-tech manufacturers, which it then supplies to clients across Australia and New Zealand, including hospitals, Crown Research Institutes and police forensic units, while providing service. Rangatira Chief Executive Phil Veal said that we will work hard with Graham, Robert and their extraordinary team at BioStrategy to drive significant growth, both organically and through acquisition where appropriate. We see great potential for growth in BioStrategy. Rangatira has been looking for further investments, saying it prefers middle market businesses which are profitable and generate revenue of at least $20 million with strong growth potential, and prefers to invest as a cornerstone shareholder. Mr. Veal told Business Desk he sees most of the growth opportunities in Australia and New Zealand, with large corporates with heavy research and development investment, education providers and public health and services the target markets. He said, we've got hardware items we're either customising here for local clients and local conditions, but actually servicing them with people who really know their stuff here. Rangatira is still on the hunt for new investments, and Mr. Veal says he expects to make some announcements in the next 6 to 12 months. He said, we think it's a good time to put that capital to work, so we're actively out in the market. Rangatira has two classes of shares that trade on the unlisted platform, with 35% held as Class A shares and 65% in Class B shares to differentiate between charitable and non-charitable shareholders. The A shares last traded on June 19 at $9.50, while the B shares traded on June 29th at $9.30. Let's talk oil. China's plunging share market is having a beneficial side effect for motorists. Oil prices have fallen to 3-month lows as signs point to a further slowing of China's economy. China's appetite for oil has been the biggest factor keeping prices high over the past decade or so, and is still forecast by the International Energy Agency to account for 29% of global demand growth this year. Adding to the China concerns are an expected new flow of Iranian oil as the nuclear arms talks in Vienna progress, and financial market volatility from the debt saga in Greece. The Greeks' no vote in the bailout referendum has driven investors into the US dollar, which typically pushes oil prices down. Meanwhile, Iran has indicated it wants to export even more crude than previously expected. Prices started to slide late last week as data showed US producers had sent more drilling rigs to work for the first time since December. This dampened threats producers would start reducing production to curb a world supply glut. When futures trading in New York ceased this morning, the US benchmark crude had fallen $4.38 or 7.7% to US $52.53 a barrel, the biggest in percentage terms for a single session since February. Brent crude, the global benchmark, was down $3.85 or 6.4% to $56.47 a barrel on ICE Futures Europe, its lowest settlement price since the week of April the 6th. New Zealand motorists should see some price movement at the pump, though the pricing will also be affected by the fall in the New Zealand dollar.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 7th. I'm John Stewart. There's a defamation case underway in the High Court at Wellington between competing accounting professional bodies. Reporter Jenny Ruth has been covering the case. Jenny, can you bring us up to speed with just who the parties are and what are their claims?
Well, the person doing the suing is the new kid on the block, CPA Australia. They're new here, I should hasten to say, but their origins in Australia go back to the 1800s, just like the other parties do. and that's the former New Zealand Institute of Chartered Accountants. They've now merged with their Australian counterpart. But for many, many years, up until 2012, you had to be a chartered accountant to perform certain accounting work, such as company audits. And recent deregulation has opened up the field, and now CPA Australia its members can, if they're suitably qualified, perform audits and do other work that was previously restricted to the chartered accountants. And obviously, CPA argues that new accountants, like graduates, where its membership growth is going to be, because once you belong to a professional association, there's very few people switch at a later stage. So it's very keen to enrol students. Now, it's saying that...
just to interrupt you, so CPA is suing the former New Zealand Institute of Chartered Accountants, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And
so
CPA
what's it claiming?
Yes, it's saying that between 2011 and 2013, in a number of venues, like at 2 conferences of accountants, in a flyer for students at Massey University's Albany campus, in advertisements published in the New Zealand Herald and the National Business Review, and in a story published in NBR, that the Institute defamed it. That it belittled its education standards, saying they were inferior to those of the Chartered Accountants organisations. It implied that it misused membership fees, and that the CPA didn't have as good international connections as the Chartered Accountants organisation.
Right.
Now, they're all allegations that are being tested in court. The Institute still hasn't got to a stage of presenting its defence, but we have got a glimmer of what it might argue in its defence in its cross-examination yesterday. Its questions implied that CPA Australia hasn't suffered any loss of members, and that's one of the things that CPA claimed as a result. And it's also saying that CPA had an opportunity at a Wellington conference to rebut whatever was said by the Chartered Accountants organisation, and it failed to do so. This case is obviously continuing, and the Institute is about to make its case later this afternoon. It will reveal what its defence is.
Right. Okay, well, thanks for that summary, Jenny, and I'm sure you'll stay across the case for us.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free, and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
I'm Grant Walker with Last Call. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. Is building a business part of running a business? That's the taxing question. New Zealand's export goal could require $200 billion in investment. Business confidence drops to its lowest level in 3 years. The Commerce Commission to file court proceedings against Wrightson, Elders and more. And your views on the Hanover settlement. To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio. And here's a thought. You can always stream NBR Radio in your car on the way home.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 7th. I'm John Stewart. The key to increasing prosperity is productivity growth. In his Editor's Insight today, Neville Gibson examines a new OECD report on the future of productivity. Neville, what's the report's main finding?
Well, the OECD is a think tank for the world's 20-odd richest countries, and its reports are looked up to as benchmarks against how the member countries can compare themselves, and of course New Zealand is among them. The report's a response to a slowdown in productivity throughout the developed world over the past decade, and it's also added to concerns about whether we can actually get back to stronger economic growth. Now, most of these countries are struggling when they reach 2 to 3%, which New Zealand's had lately, and there are many doing much worse. But some politicians have, such as Jeb Bush in America, have raised the say, well, why can't we get back to 4% growth in the US? And he's been proposing, along with some economists, policies focused on long-term tax and regulatory reforms, which of course have become much tougher since the collapse, the financial collapse. And in essence, this new OECD research is to answer that question, but it's looking more at how to spread innovation and make better use of human talent and get a bit of productivity growth going that way.
Well, they're talking about a particular type of productivity, I guess. What's meant by that?
Yes, it's quite different from the old-style productivity, which was, we think back to the Industrial Revolution, the discovery of electricity, the invention of the internal combustion engine, right through to the space age and machines and computers. But this is the kind of productivity that's better understood by saying working smarter rather than working harder. And it reflects the ability to produce more output by better combining the inputs thanks to new ideas, technological innovation, new business methods. And the report, The Future of Productivity, it identifies what it sees as some of the impediments to achieving these kind of growth in these areas.
What are these impediments?
Well, the Secretary-General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, he has launched this report in Mexico City overnight, and he says that slower innovation is not the root cause of the current productivity slowdown. The problem is the pace at which these innovations spread throughout the economy. He calls it the breakdown of the diffusion machine. And he sees this as being the key to reducing inequality, and he urges that governments look harder at the way this knowledge diffusion and getting rid of those roadblocks, and it's a focus on skills development and better allocation of human talent. And the research shows that the gap between the high productivity firms and the rest has been increasing, which suggests that this is where the main problem is.
So how does New Zealand fare in the productivity rankings?
Well, we had some figures out last week and a couple of reports on innovation, and these actually identified that New Zealand companies are actually very good at innovation at the very early stage, coming up with new ideas and products, but they fail on the implementation, and certainly the reports showed quite an inability to get to international markets. In fact, the author of one of the reports from the Productivity Commission, he put it down to a lack of skills in companies at the top level. They lack the combination of technological, marketing and management level skills. And if you read this against the background of the OECD report, you see it's the pressure is really on the education systems to deliver this necessary range of skills. In fact, the report says around a quarter of the workers, and that's all the OECD nations, not just New Zealand, reported a mismatch between their existing skills and those that were required for the kind of jobs they were doing.
So what other policies can sustain productivity growth?
Well, a lot of these aren't really new ideas. In fact, the OECD is really refreshing a lot of them, but some of them are like around bankruptcy laws. They say you can't have innovation without failure, so it shouldn't penalise companies for failure, and so they say there should be more incentives for companies to experiment, allocate resources, that sort of thing, but also look after them when they fail. Making labour mobility easier is another one. That's a catchphrase for being able to hire and fire more quickly. Obviously, there's a lot of resistance to that sort of idea. One that the earlier reports done in New Zealand is government investment in basic research. They see that as necessary to get the ideas off the platform and into commercialisation, and policies that don't discriminate between small and large companies. In fact, the New Zealand research showed that we're pretty good on virtually all of those 4 points that the OECD is outlining.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Neville.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant, an unparalleled private dining room choice. NBR Radio.
To market and court news, the Commerce Commission intends to file court proceedings against PGG Wrightson, Elders New Zealand and Rural Livestock by the end of the month, claiming the 3 fixed fees charged during the implementation of a national livestock tagging scheme. The Consumer Protection Authority is investigating fees charged during the adoption of the National Animal Identification and Trading Act 2012, commonly known as NATE. A spokesman for the Commission confirmed it intends to file proceedings against the 3 agricultural companies and 5 undisclosed individuals before the end of this month. NATE is an industry-based initiative which the government helped fund, requiring radio tags for cattle and deer and allowing nationwide tracing of livestock in a bid to bolster New Zealand's response to any biosecurity threats. Yesterday, Wrightson, the listed rural services firm controlled by China's Agriacorp, revealed the Commission believed it had breached the Commerce Act over how it charged fees during the scheme's implementation and that it would seek a pecuniary penalty from PGW. Wrightson has cooperated with the investigation and said the penalty, while significant, is unlikely to be materially price-sensitive. Companies convicted of price fixing can attract a maximum penalty that's the greater of 10 million or 3 times the commercial gain, or if that can't be established easily, 10% of turnover. Rural Livestock Chairman John Fawkes said he didn't know about the investigation and declined to comment. Elders New Zealand also declined to comment. Wrightson shares were unchanged at 47 cents on the NZX. In retail development, returning retail specialist Belinda Korda-Kruger says New Zealand is becoming increasingly attractive to international markets, and the latest moves by David Jones and Topshop come as no surprise. She's come back after 20 years in Hong Kong, where at the end of her stay, she was running the leasing and site acquisitions team for Marks & Spencer Asia. Ms. Korda-Kruger says Marks & Spencer are in Hong Kong and Singapore and are studying Australia. New Zealand is just another hop. We expect, she says, to see more international retailers here over time. New Zealand's property returns are already seen as high and less risky by overseas standards. The scarcity and high cost of land in Auckland is pushing a trend toward mixed-use developments. These have a synergy with Hong Kong, where many people live above shopping centres, allowing for longer shopping hours and a higher degree of lifestyle and entertainment choices. She says Auckland is experiencing a development curve that looks unstoppable. She says my Asian experience is very relevant, something I hadn't appreciated until I arrived back. Apart from working for a global retailer while in Hong Kong, Ms. Korda-Kruger established a company combining her property background with her love of art. Art Lease is the largest art rental company in Hong Kong, and she sold the company 12 years later to a private hedge fund. Since returning to Auckland, Ms. Korda-Kruger has started work at RCG, a property research, architecture and design company, where she's continuing to work with international retailers. The company is reported to have relationships with international retail brands IKEA, Bridgestone and Levi's, and more recently with eyewear giant Coastal. Ms. Korda-Kruger is focusing on the international brands area of the retail market.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 7th, I'm John Stewart. Business confidence has fallen to the lowest level in 3 years, but it's still relatively high. I'm joined by our political and economics editor in Wellington, Rob Hosking. Rob, just how are these figures looking if you go beneath them, let's say?
Yeah, this is an important survey. This is the quarterly survey, the NZIR survey. They've been running it since 1970. They survey roughly 2,000 businesses.
No farmers, though, are there?
No farmers. It's one of the most important leading indicators. It's and as far as that farm picture goes, and you can see that in some of these figures this morning. It does, of course, survey businesses who supply the farming sector, and the biggest drop really was in the retail sector, and it was very noticeable that when you looked at the regional breakdown of that, the areas where that was falling is in the areas which are high dairy supply areas, so Waikato, Taranaki, Southland, etc. So this is so the dairy slowdown is showing in that area.
Yeah, it's certainly feeding through, isn't it?
It certainly is, and the question really, and this is the biggest question overriding the entire economy at the moment, is how long it's going to feed through, because 6 weeks or less than 6 weeks ago, a month ago, the assumption was that certainly the Reserve Bank was still making the assumption that the dairy slowdown would be sort of picking up again. The dairy price would be picking up again, and going back a month before that, or 3 weeks before that, the Treasury forecast and the budget, and they were talking about GDP growth of around 3% for each of the next 3 years. Today's survey suggests otherwise. We're still looking at growth. We're certainly not looking at a recession. But today's figures suggest, I asked Christina Ling, who's the senior economist there, and she said, look, around 2.6% GDP. The other thing is, and I'd add a caveat to that, because I think even that might turn out to be slightly on the high side. This survey was done earlier in June, and it covered, most of the responses came in before the Reserve Bank's last monetary policy statement. That's when they announced they cut the official cash rate 0.25% and signalled there'd be at least one more rate cut.
Yeah, well, I mean, what is Christina Leung forecasting about the OCR as a result of these figures?
Well, they've firmed up their expectations of another cut at the end of the month rather than in September. The Reserve Bank next reviews the OCR on the 23rd of July. And look, the NZIA is not the only bunch of economists who are saying that. It's increasingly looking likely that Governor Graham Wheeler will do another 0.25% cut on the 23rd of July. The question is, what happens after that, whether there's one more, whether there's two more, and the timing of that. And the next cut timing after that is September. The NZIA this morning said, look, they see that as a line call. I'm starting to wonder if it is going to be such a line call, and even that suggested there could even be a fourth one in October or early December.
Indeed. Okay, thanks very much for your insights there, Rob.
NBR
Radio.
Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 7th. I'm John Stewart. Now, Auckland Council's spending needs a spotlight shone on it, according to Councillor Christine Fletcher, who joins me now. Christine, why are you calling for a spotlight to be shone here?
The general rate increase for most residents has just grown like topsy since the Auckland Council was formed. And I think we have reached a point where it is not fair and it is not sustainable. Some of us have come together in the past and tried to put up alternative budgets unsuccessfully, but I think it really requires a united effort of the whole council really re-examining all of the activities that it's involved in.
Now, you want a line-by-line review of spending.
Well, it doesn't necessarily need to be line by line. But when the council came together, there were a whole range of activities that legacy councils had been involved in, and they just sort of got thrown into the mix. We have never fully gone out to consult with the public on a lot of the areas of social spending that the council is currently involved in. I'm very supportive of some of the transport investment that we need to make, similarly with parks, because that is part of the growth, and whether it's supporting the SHAs and the unitary plan. I know that those funds are being intensely scrutinised, not the least through government, with JMAC, which is the Joint Modelling Application Centre that NZTA, Council and Auckland Transport work on. But what we haven't had the same degree of spotlight on has been the social spend of council. That has never been thoroughly consulted on.
What do you mean by the social spend?
Well, I think there are activities that council is involved through its CCO Comet, some of the housing activities. The reality is that if we are going to make the investments that we must make in transport, that really will be the driver for taking Auckland forward and is the main responsibility of local government, then some things need to give. Some things need to go.
Like what?
As I said, we've got areas of social spend, like the Comet CCO, that I think are absolutely worthy. That, the aspirations are great, but they are more for funding from rating than property tax, which we have with rates. The reality is with rates now, in communities like my own, people have been paying 10% plus year on year on year, and it's just not sustainable. Day before, I received a notice from Auckland Council saying, early notice of the fact your rates will increase by between $3,000 to $4,000 this year. How can we help? Would you like to pay monthly? Would you like to pay weekly? Now, that actually doesn't fix it, just the way that we might stagger the payment on those. I think people in the community that I live in are expecting council to treat our finances as they would treat their own personally in terms of what is fair and what is sustainable. And the current situation is not sustainable.
Would you have the council-controlled organisations in your sites as well?
I think everything has to be in our sites. As I say, with Auckland Transport, I am in the position of knowing that the integrated plan that we are looking at with government is actually, it's gone through some quite robust analysis. But I think we have to continue to keep it in our sites. But ATED and I think the new Auckland Development CCO is going to require very, very great scrutiny, because it's got the potential to grow like Topsy unless we, are pretty careful about it. But I'm confident we've got a good CEO now. When the council came together, the Auckland plan was put to the public, and that was never costed. And it was like anything that aligns to the Auckland plan, we'll go and fund it. And really, council acted like a pack of drunken sailors in port as we agreed to fund a whole range of activities. What I'm saying is we need to be able to pull back on some of those now if we are going to fulfil our obligations in terms of the growth that Auckland is experiencing. If we are going to fund these transport initiatives that we know through consultation that the public want to see us supporting, then there's going to have to be some changes in some of the areas of funding that we are now doing. And that's really the thrust of what I want the CEO to pick up on. The new CEO that we have, Stephen Town, has already identified $2.6 billion worth of savings over the long-term funding plan that we have.
In what areas?
They are operational efficiencies that he is yet to identify and will bring to the councillors. But I am saying that we need to find more. The assumptions that underlie the current long-term funding plan on the rate increases, along with capital valuation, and that's an area maybe that the government really need to think about, whether in light of Auckland rising property values, whether that is going to be sustainable in itself. But the assumptions underpinning the current long-term funding plan are going to drive some people from their homes because they will not be able to afford to pay the rates.
That's pretty strong stuff. What sort of political support do you have on the full council?
Well, I think if you look at the final vote on the long-term funding plan, it was very close. In the past, I've had between 6 and 7 councillors like me that are wanting to have some very close examination of the general rate. Leading up into the long-term funding plan, there was a very sharp focus on the targeted transport rate, and I think in a way that obscured the serious analysis that we needed to bring to the general rate, which is the driver for a lot of the rate increases that we're going to see now and into the future. And I can tell you that when the public hear mid-July what their rates are likely to be, and when they receive their rating notices early in August, I think there is going to be a really adverse reaction on the Auckland Council that could actually flow into negativity around amalgamation. And I just want to be able to give some sense of hope and possibility to the public that we are taking this seriously. It is not going to be a cost-plus council. So in terms of support, I know that I have a small group of core councillors who have been concerned about this for some considerable time, but I think the mood is turning for some of the undecided councillors as they realise they are going to drive some residents from their community, and that we have to do better.
Councillor Christine Fletcher, thank you very much for that.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett, partying since 1959. www.hoteldebret.com. NBR Radio.
To the dollar. The New Zealand dollar was little changed overnight as traders who have fled to the perceived safety of currencies such as the yen awaited further developments in Greece. The Kiwi edged up to 66.84 US at 8 this morning. The TWI was at 70.47. Currency markets stabilised overnight after initial concerns about a possible Grexit prompted demand for safe haven instruments and away from higher risk assets such as the Kiwi. Greece voted against a bailout plan in a referendum at the weekend, and the country's finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis, resigned, potentially paving the way for better relations with the country's creditors. Peter Kavanagh, client advisor at Bancorp Treasury Services, said, "We have seen the initial rush to safety led by the yen. We've seen a little adjustment to people's risk positioning. It's a holding pattern, but the attitude toward risk remains fragile. It's still a long way from resolution." So in New Zealand today, the focus will be on the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research quarterly survey of business opinion. While confidence will probably ease, the survey doesn't capture the agriculture sector, which has been hurt by declining dairy prices, according to analysts. In Australia, all eyes will be on the Reserve Bank of Australia meeting, where interest rates are expected to remain unchanged. So the New Zealand dollar slipped to 89.11 Australian cents, advanced to 81.87 yen, was little changed at 60.45 euro and 42.82 British pence. To the courts and taxation. Deloitte tax partner Campbell Rose says the Court of Appeal appears to have decided the costs of building a business aren't part of the costs of running a business. Like EY, Mr Rose is saying the government may need to legislate to fix the problem thrown up by last month's ruling against Trustpower in its dispute with Inland Revenue. The court ruled that $17.7 million of spending on feasibility studies, including resource consent applications, can't be treated as business expenses and immediately deducted for tax purposes. Instead, such spending should be treated as capital spending and depreciated against the eventual asset. Mr Rose says in the Court of Appeal's view, expenditure aimed at building an existing business, the goal surely of every business, is not incurred in carrying on that business. He says, taken to its logical conclusion, this means that only expenditure directly incurred in relation to the income-earning aspect of a business will ever be deductible. The court appears to have worked backward, asking whether the expense is capital in nature first before considering what is usually the first question of whether the expense is linked to carrying on normal business. Mr Rose says it was less than clear in the judgment quite how far you fall over. It seemed to get to base 2 before they got to base 1. The judgment goes against the government's approach of eliminating such problems known as black hole spending. He says bit by bit we've been fixing it in New Zealand. We've been patching it up with band-aids as we go along, but I do really wonder whether we need a better solution. He says there's a real cost to business. If businesses have to spend time and money on deciding whether they can deduct spending for tax purposes, I would have thought that acts as a handbrake on New Zealand running faster. And getting into disputes such as trust powers with Inland Revenue is expensive. Mr Rose says it's a dead weight cost. He suggests New Zealand might adopt the Australian law covering black hole spending. That allows expenses such as feasibility studies, legal expenses, due diligence costs, equity raising costs, the cost of complying with regulations, the cost of earthquake strengthening and other such costs to be depreciated over 5 years. Trustpower had 20 business days to decide whether to appeal the June 19 Court of Appeal decision. Let's talk business confidence that has fallen to the lowest level in 3 years but is still relatively high. New Zealand Institute of Economic Research senior economist Christina Luang says expectations have fallen but from lofty levels. The Institute's latest quarterly survey of business opinion shows net optimists at 13%, down from 26% in March when it comes to their own business. That's consistent with annual GDP growth for the year to June of below 3%, probably about 2.6%, she says. That's down from the previous expectation of a little above 3%. Firms' views about the wider business situation have fallen more dramatically, down from a net positive of 20% to 7%. The survey, which is of more than 2,000 non-farm businesses and which has been running since 1970, is a major forward indicator of business activity and economic performance. Ms Weng says the fallback in today's survey indicates further interest rate cuts will be needed. The Reserve Bank began cutting the OCR last month, dropping it from 3.5 to 3.25% and signalling at least one more cut before the end of the year. However, the Reserve Bank accompanied this with forecasts for GDP growth of about 3%. These forecasts are in line with Treasury forecasts, but are now looking too optimistic, as they were made on the assumption the global dairy prices would soon bottom out. Instead, dairy prices have continued to fall, and more recently there's been high-profile financial market turmoil in Greece and China. Today's survey result points to a further OCR cut later this month, and probably one, perhaps two more, she says. Mr. Wing says, but the Reserve Bank is having to walk a fine line between minimal inflation and an Auckland property market inferno. I expect this result would give it further cause for rate cuts. It is a line ball called in September, but I would not rule out an October cut as well.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
This is Nick Grant for NBR Radio. I'm talking to Dr. Brian Edwards about his opinion piece posted on nbr.co.nz about Pebble Hooper's offensive tweet over the weekend and what the wash-up has been. So, Brian, can you quickly give us a little summary of said tweet and your response to it?
Well, I thought it was a pretty horrifying thing that Pebble said, and I thought it was something that was going to be very hurtful and harmful to a lot of people. It was going to be very harmful to all the relatives of the people who had died in that house, the grandparents, the aunts and uncles, the wider Cook Island family, and so on. And it was also just inherently a really, really horrible thing to say, Once you start talking about natural selection, you're implying that there is some sort of organic failing or lack in these people, that there is they have inherited poor genes or a lack of intelligence or whatever you like. So this is about as unkind and cruel as you can possibly get in terms of talking about other people who, are not really likely to be the sort of people whose relatives are going to have any response to make or the ability to make any response. So this was at the far end of nastiness, in my view. So, and that's essentially why I wrote the post.
Well, certainly your view is certainly shared by a vast number of our readers, it seems, and
yes.
you'll be interested to know
shared
that
by the people commenting on my website as well.
Yeah,
very widely spread, and in fact, I would say pretty well universal was the condemnation of Pebbles in this matter. And of course, I know Pebbles, and I've been on the Paul Henry show with her on a couple of occasions. We're at the entirely opposite ends of the political and social scale. That's she's very right wing. And she's made that very clear when we've been on the program together. I'm very left-wing. I tend to be somewhat forgiving of people's flaws, and Pebbles, and I rather suspect her family aren't. So we're right at the opposite end of the scale.
Yeah, she's hardly a great poster child for compassionate conservatism, isn't she?
No, not at all, really. We had a debate when we were together on the Paul Henry show about, whether people in prison should have cell phones, and that was fascinating because I got the distinct impression from Pebbles that people in prison shouldn't have anything, perhaps a little food, but not much more than that. And so she and I were never likely to agree.
Right. Well, the New Zealand Herald, for whom Pebbles Hooper was the co-editor of the gossip spy pages in the Herald on Sunday, have moved swiftly to cauterise this controversy, and it was announced today that the editor of the Weekend Herald papers, Miriam Alexander, has accepted the resignation of Ms. Hooper. I suspect that she was probably given a choice of resigning or being fired.
Well, that's a guess, and probably at the moment neither you nor I know that. But it wouldn't surprise me at all if Pebbles had resigned. I mean, there's a couple of things here that I think are worth saying. Pebbles was essentially saying that, what these people had done, that the mistake that the mother had made was sort of unforgivable, and an indication that she wasn't very bright. And now she has herself made a mistake, quite a serious mistake. But it occurs to me that she's been beaten about the head fairly severely about this. I mean, not just in my own on my own website, but pretty well across the whole entire web. Condemnation, left, right, and centre. And I've sort of moved to the point now of thinking maybe that's enough now. That she's a youngish person, she's made an error. She probably has the arrogance of youth as well. And I think maybe now we've reached the stage where enough nasty things have been said about her that maybe that should be left alone now. So I'm in a kind of forgiving mood about Pebbles at the moment.
Sure. Do you think it was right of her to resign and right of the Herald to accept that resignation?
I think it was probably right of her to resign. I mean, there are points beyond which you cannot go, and I think that was the case here. Once those words "natural selection" were used, and the implication, of course, is that an entire group of people are inferior in some way, and that these people belong to that group of people who are inferior. Once you've and should probably be got rid of in some way. Once you've said something like that, I mean, you're moving into what is almost a sort of Nazi philosophy, the survival of the fittest, that sort of thing. And so that's an unacceptable view in a country like New Zealand, because that was the sense I got from it. There was some inherent inferiority about these people that had something to do maybe with them being Cook Islanders or whatever it might be. And you just can't do that in New Zealand, and nor should you be able to do that in New Zealand. So I think the resignation was absolutely inevitable, combined, of course, with the amount of flack that she's taken. I don't think she had any other choice, really.
Given that you're feeling relatively forgiving towards Pebbles now, I mean, do you have any thoughts about how she might go about rehabilitating herself?
That's pretty difficult, isn't it? I think probably you have to kind of disappear from the scene for a while. I don't think you can instantly do anything to rehabilitate yourself. She's made an apology, but the fact of the matter is that when you've said the sort of thing that Pebbles said, no one is going to accept the apology. People will even regard the apology as being self-serving. Oh, bugger, I've made a horrible mistake, now I better quickly apologize. I think that's the sort of feeling that people would have. So her apology will not be accepted, I would imagine, by the general population. And so you just have to withdraw. You have to withdraw for a while, and then maybe in a few months you can come back again and start doing other things. But in the meantime, no one's going to accept your apology. They won't believe it.
Sure. Now, I guess this is an example of a widespread trend where you could argue that platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and so on, which are touted as social media, are increasingly becoming the forum of very antisocial interactions.
Well, I think that's been the case for a long time now. I'm constantly horrified by the things that I read that people have written on Twitter and people have said on Facebook. And the real cause of this and the real problem with this is that these are anonymous media. So the vast majority of people who write stuff on Twitter do so anonymously. The same with Facebook. The same with a whole lot of other media. And while you have that situation where, even your own magazine, NBR, a lot of the stuff that appears in NBR is anonymous. I think this is something that we should get rid of. I think if you have an opinion, it's a strong opinion, a critical opinion, you should put your name to it. If I write a post, I put my name to it. The vast majority of people who engage in social media and make strong opinions about other people do not have the courage to put their name to what they write. And I think as long as that is the case, you'll get this sort of stuff going on.
Do you think it's possibly a function of being in a small country where people often bend over backwards, not to offend others in person or at least be associated with saying offensive remarks, that people flocked to the opportunity to snipe at others?
To me, it's simpler than that. This is just a matter of people not having the courage of their convictions. If you really have a strong opinion on something, why would you not put your name to it? And there can only be a small group of people in New Zealand who have to keep their names out of things because it would be damaging to their careers or damaging to their lives in some way. Most people, that's not the case. The vast majority of people who might write something on Twitter, if they put their names to it, you'd have no idea who they were. So this is the sort of moral cowardice that we have, I think, that's been allowed to spread because of the anonymity of media like Facebook, Twitter, and so on. I think it's quite a serious business, really.
Sure. Now, you obviously provide media advice professionally. What's your advice to clients about the way they should behave on social media?
Probably the best advice you could give to people from that point of view would be to stay off social media. That would probably be my advice. For the most part, it's probably not going to do you very much good, and there's an extreme likelihood that it's going to do you some harm. So it's a Wild West sort of form of media, social media, and I think if you go in there's a fair chance you're going to be shot.
Well, and on that note, Dr. Brian Edwards, thank you very much for your time.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform, www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
Let's talk export. Economic Development Minister Stephen Joyce says New Zealand needs 160 to 200 billion of business investment to meet the government's goals for boosting exports and research and development spending, requiring a better strategy to lure overseas funds and entrepreneurs. Mr Joyce this week got Cabinet approval to develop what he calls the New Zealand Investment Attraction Strategy, and has established a task force made up of officials from NZ Trade and Enterprise, the Ministry of Business, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Callaghan Innovation and the Treasury to lead the work. He also plans targeted consultation with the private sector to be run through his office. The government's targets are to lift exports to 40% of GDP and lift R&D spending to 1% of GDP. The paper he took to the Cabinet breaks the plan down into three themes. The first is to attract high-quality foreign direct investment in areas where New Zealand is competitive, in tradable and innovation-enhancing sectors, which are most likely to benefit the whole economy. The paper says we propose the target for Theme 1 to be to facilitate investments with a potential direct economic impact of $5 billion over 3 years. The second theme is to attract overseas investment in R&D in New Zealand, especially to encourage multinational companies to locate R&D facilities here. The target will be to attract 10 new offshore companies to relocate R&D activity to New Zealand over the next 5 years. The third theme is to lift New Zealand's pool of smart capital by convincing individual investors and entrepreneurs to live in the country. The target is to double the amount of actual and committed capital migrant investors and entrepreneurs have brought to New Zealand to $7 billion within 3 years. To achieve this, the paper suggests will require an end-to-end approach, from the design of visa categories and approval processes through to programs to attract the right migrants. Mr Joyce proposes a review of migrant visa categories to enhance their attractiveness to high-quality applicants, tailored promotional events in key offshore markets to secure investors and entrepreneurs to New Zealand, and the capacity to provide a responsive, personalised service for high-value applicants to facilitate further investment. The paper says R&D spending should increase employment opportunities for Kiwis in science, technology, engineering and mathematics. Sectors to be targeted will be those already identified by NZTE and Callaghan: primary industries, premium food and beverage, specialising manufacturing, infrastructure, oil, gas and mining, ICT, digital and shared services. The strategy would leverage the existing offshore networks of MFAT, NZTE, Immigration New Zealand and Kia New Zealand to generate investment leads, the paper says. Mr Joyce said achieving the government's goal of building a strong, competitive economy with increasing numbers of higher paid jobs requires ongoing significant increases in business investment. In property news, private investors are lining up to make over Auckland's old CBD council headquarters, one of the most disliked buildings in the city. About 20 investors and developers have expressed interest in the 100-metre tall former Civic Administration building on a 5,000 square metre Grays Ave site for offices, apartments or a hotel. The building has been empty since last year, when staff shifted to the former ASB Centre on Albert Street, which cost the council $150.7 million to buy and refurbish. The council can't afford to do anything with its old headquarters because it's unsuitable for long-term use without significant refurbishment and removal of asbestos installed as a fire retardant when it was built. The council has gone out to the private sector for help. Most of the interest is in conversion of the Civic building into 126 apartments, 7 per floor from levels 1 to 18, costing about $79 million. There's no interest in turning the property into a 180-room hotel at about $92 million, and little appetite for an office makeover costing $95 million, as there is limited commercial demand in the Aotea Quarter. Reports show the high cost of restoring the building into offices for potential council and regional facilities Auckland users are disproportionately high when compared to private sector rental options near Aotea Square. Investors and developers' proposals must contain plans for restoring the building's heritage features, intensifying the site and making a frontage to Merrill Drive, and for the property to be complementary to and enhancing the Aotea Centre as the key performing arts centre for the region. Regional Facilities Auckland is working on a refurbishment plan for Aotea Square. Although there's strong interest in using the building for apartments, there are concerns it would potentially limit civic uses of Aotea Square, particularly activities that people think are noisy. The council said it assumed any residential uses will be designated to minimise noise disturbance, and covenants will be arranged to stop people objecting to events in the square and its surrounds. A short list of contenders will be drawn up based on track record, capability, capacity and alignment with the agreed conditions. They will be reduced to 2 or 3 candidates who will draw up detailed design plans before the final development partner is selected. As a carrot, the council says it will sell the freehold to the property or offer a long-term leasehold. If investors or developers can't make a refurbishment stack up financially, the council has said in the past it will be torn down. Councillor Chris Darby says it would be a shame to have it torn down as Auckland has lost many of its historic buildings to the demolition ball. The property was at the leading edge of building technology when designed in the 1950s and opened in 1966. Mr Darby wants it to be given a heritage designation, and 2 reports suggest it could be worthy of a Category A or B scheduling. In market news, biomedical company Pacific Edge's renounceable rights offer closed 2/3 subscribed, but the underwriter says the remaining shares have been mopped up by institutional investors. Shareholders affected by a postal delay just announced by Pacific Edge to the NZX will still receive shares. The rights offer, under which shareholders could subscribe for 2 new shares for every 11 held, was announced on May 28 and has closed, raising $35.3 million. This will help fund the company's US growth strategy, potentially launch into Singapore as a gateway to Southeast Asia, and complete commercialisation of its 3rd and 4th cancer diagnostics CX bladder tests. About 65% of the offer was taken up by investors, raising $23 million from 37.7 million new shares issued. The remaining 35% of the offer was taken up by underwriter First New Zealand Capital, who passed most of it on to the sub-underwriters. Salt Funds Management issued a SSH notice yesterday showing its increased holdings. First New Zealand Investment Banking Director Dave Watt says he's comfortable with the level of shortfall within the offer and is happy with the outcome. He says the offer was well supported by local institutions, which is a really good sign of the support the New Zealand capital markets show for genuine New Zealand growth stories. Because First New Zealand underwrote the offer, we're essentially responsible for the 1/3 of the shares that didn't sell, but we had sub-underwritten them out to a broad range of existing and new institutional investors who've taken that stock. Mr Watt says the level of shortfall was what First New Zealand was expecting based on the offer's relatively modest level of discount, 6.2%, compared to the hedged share price at the time the offer was announced. He said it's a reasonably big raise for Pacific Edge by historical standards, and $35 million is a pretty big number for a business of that size. The company has a big retail register with a lot of small shareholders who've been with the company for a long time. Sometimes they take up the rights, sometimes not. Pacific Edge notified the NZX this afternoon that some of its shareholders missed out on the offer due to delayed mail. The company says it was told today by New Zealand Post subsidiary Converger Group that there had been a delay in delivery of mail that included a number of shareholder applications to the rights issue. These applications would have been valid if they'd been delivered before the June 29 closing date. First New Zealand will transfer some shares to shareholders affected by the late delivery, according to the notice.
Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today. www.nbr.co.nz/subscribe. NBR.